Some secrets are meant to stay buried in dusty attics and forgotten closets. But when a young military historian stumbled upon a weathered leather jacket at a garage sale, she had no idea she was about to uncover one of the most classified operations in naval history, or that the laughing captain who dismissed her find would soon be demanding answers from the Pentagon. The morning fog clung to the suburban streets of San Diego like a protective shroud, muffling the sounds of early Saturday traffic. Dr. Sarah Mitchell pulled her worn Honda Civic to the curb, squinting through the windshield at the hand-painted sign that read, "Moving Sail. Everything must go." At 28, Sarah had developed an almost supernatural ability to spot military memorabilia from 3 blocks away, a skill that had served her well during her 5 years as a naval historian at the Maritime Museum. The elderly woman running the sale looked tired, her silver hair escaping from a loose bun as she directed her teenage grandson to rearrange folding tables laden with decades of accumulated possessions. Sarah approached with the practiced eye of someone who had spent countless hours cataloging artifacts, her gaze immediately drawn to a box of tarnished medals and faded photographs tucked beneath a card table. "Military family?" Sarah asked gently, recognizing the telltale signs of a career Navy household in the precise arrangement of items and the respectful way the memorabilia had been displayed. The woman, who introduced herself as Eleanor Hawkins, nodded with a mixture of pride and sadness. "My husband served 42 years. Passed last month." She gestured toward a portrait of a distinguished-looking man in dress blues. "Harold always said I need to get rid of his old things eventually, but I never thought it would be so soon." Sarah's heart went out to the widow, understanding the weight of preserving a loved one's legacy. She had seen this scene played out dozens of times in her work, families struggling to find appropriate homes for military heirlooms that held deep personal meaning but little monetary value to most buyers. As Sarah carefully examined the collection, her fingers brushed against something unexpected buried beneath a stack of yellowed newspapers. She lifted the papers to reveal a leather flight jacket, its brown surface weathered and cracked with age. The jacket bore the unmistakable patina of genuine military issue, but something about it seemed different from the standard pieces she encountered in her research. "How much for this jacket?" Sarah asked, trying to keep her voice casual despite the quickening of her pulse. There was something about the craftsmanship, the particular shade of the leather, that suggested this piece predated anything she had cataloged before. Eleanor squinted at the jacket, then shrugged. "Harold found that thing in his father's stuff years ago. Honestly thought I'd thrown it away. $5. Sarah handed over the money without hesitation, carefully folding the jacket and placing it in her canvas bag. She spent another hour browsing the sale, purchasing several other items, including a compass, some navigation charts, and a collection of Herald service photographs. Eleanor seemed grateful for Sarah's genuine interest in preserving her husband's memory, and they exchanged contact information before Sarah departed. Back in her small apartment near the museum, Sarah spread the jacket across her dining table under the bright light of her desk lamp. The first thing that struck her was the weight. This wasn't the lightweight synthetic material used in modern flight gear, but genuine horsehide that had been expertly tanned and treated. The stitching showed the precise handiwork of military contractors from an earlier era. Each seam reinforced with the kind of attention to detail that suggested this jacket had been built for extreme conditions. The zipper was particularly intriguing, bearing markings from a manufacturer she didn't immediately recognize. Sarah photographed the hardware from multiple angles, making notes about the distinctive brass fittings and the unusual configuration of the storm flap. As she turned the jacket over, she noticed something that made her breath catch: a small leather tag sewn into the inner collar, bearing a serial number and what appeared to be a production code. Sarah immediately reached for her laptop, accessing the comprehensive military database that her position at the museum afforded her. She entered the serial number, expecting to find a standard entry for a World War II or Korean War-era flight jacket. Instead, her screen displayed a message she had never seen before: classified, access denied. This was unprecedented. In 5 years of research, Sarah had encountered restricted information regarding specific operations or personnel, but never a simple equipment record that required security clearance to access. She tried several alternative search approaches, cross-referencing the manufacturer codes and production dates, but each query returned the same result. Frustrated, but intrigued, Sarah decided to bring the jacket to work on Monday morning. Her supervisor, Dr. Robert Chun, had 30 years of experience in naval history and maintained contacts throughout the military hierarchy. If anyone could help her understand why a vintage flight jacket would be classified, it would be him. The weekend passed slowly, with Sarah finding herself repeatedly drawn back to examine the jacket. She noticed details that reinforced her growing conviction that this was no ordinary piece of military gear. The pocket configurations were unusual, with several interior compartments that seemed designed for specific equipment. The collar showed evidence of electronic attachments, suggesting the jacket had been modified to accommodate communication or navigation devices that were far ahead of their time. Most intriguingly, Sarah discovered what appeared to be impact marks on the leather. Not the normal wear pattern she would expect from regular use, but specific damage that suggested exposure to extreme conditions. Under magnification, she could see microscopic scoring that looked almost like the effects of extreme temperature changes or possibly exposure to unusual atmospheric conditions. Monday morning found Sarah at the museum early, the jacket carefully wrapped in acid-free tissue paper. Dr. Chun arrived at his usual 8:30, coffee in hand, and already absorbed in the morning's correspondence. Sarah waited until he had settled into his routine before approaching with her discovery. "Bob, I need your opinion on something unusual," she began, unwrapping the jacket with the reverence of an archaeologist unveiling a significant find. "Dr." Chin set down his coffee and adjusted his glasses, his expression shifting from mild interest to sharp focus as he took in the details of the garment. After 40 years of handling military artifacts, he had developed an instinct for recognizing items of particular significance. "Where did you acquire this?" he asked, his voice carrying an undertone Sarah had rarely heard from her typically relaxed supervisor. Sarah explained the circumstances of the purchase, watching as Dr. Chen's expression grew increasingly serious. He examined the jacket with the methodical precision of an expert, paying particular attention to the construction details and hardware specifications. "Sarah, I need you to be very careful with this," he said finally. "I'm going to make some calls, but I want you to document everything about how you acquired it and store it in the secure archives until we know more." The gravity in his voice sent a chill down Sarah's spine. In the 3 years she had worked directly under Dr. Chun, she had never seen him react so seriously to any artifact, regardless of its historical significance or monetary value. That afternoon, Dr. Chun returned from a series of closed-door phone calls with an expression Sarah couldn't quite read. "I've scheduled a meeting for tomorrow with Captain Rebecca Morrison from Naval Intelligence," he announced. "She's flying down from Coronado specifically to examine your jacket." Sarah felt her stomach drop. Naval Intelligence didn't involve itself with routine historical artifacts, regardless of their age or rarity. The fact that a captain would personally travel to examine a garage sale finds suggested implications far beyond anything Sarah had imagined. "Should I be concerned?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Dr. Chun considered his words carefully. "Probably not, but this jacket has some people very interested. Captain Morrison will explain everything tomorrow." That evening, Sarah found herself unable to concentrate on anything other than the mysterious jacket now locked in the museum's secure storage facility. She researched Captain Morrison online, finding an impressive record of service, including deployments in classified operations and a current assignment to Naval Special Warfare Command. Whatever secrets the jacket held, they were significant enough to warrant attention from the highest levels of military intelligence. As she prepared for bed, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that her simple garage sale purchase had set in motion events far beyond her understanding. The weathered leather jacket, with its mysterious classification and unusual construction, represented a puzzle that someone clearly preferred to keep unsolved. Tomorrow would bring answers, but Sarah sensed that those answers might reveal more about military history than she was prepared to handle. The innocent-seeming artifact had already drawn the attention of people who dealt in secrets for a living, and Sarah was beginning to understand that some discoveries came with responsibilities she had never imagined. The fog rolled in from the Pacific that night, wrapping the city in the same protective shroud that had covered her morning discovery. But Sarah knew that by tomorrow evening, the mystery of the jacket would either be solved or would have grown into something far more complex than a simple historical curiosity. She fell asleep wondering whether Eleanor Hawkins had any idea what her late husband's family had preserved all these years, and whether Harold himself had known the true significance of the artifact he had inherited from his father. Some secrets, Sarah was beginning to realize, had a way of surviving far longer than the people who were meant to keep them. Captain Rebecca Morrison arrived at the Maritime Museum at precisely 0900 hours. Her crisp summer whites a stark contrast to the casual atmosphere of the research facility. Sarah watched through the conference room window as the officer exchanged brief words with Dr. Chun in the lobby, noting the captain's bearing and the way she carried herself with the confidence of someone accustomed to handling sensitive situations. At 35, Captain Morrison possessed the kind of quiet authority that came from years of making decisions under pressure. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a regulation bun, and her green eyes seemed to catalog every detail of her surroundings with the efficiency of a trained intelligence officer. When Dr. Chun led her into the conference room, Sarah felt suddenly underdressed in her museum-appropriate khakis and polo shirt. "Dr. Mitchell," Captain Morrison said, extending her hand with a firm grip that conveyed both professionalism and a subtle warning. "I understand you've made an interesting discovery." Sarah nodded, gesturing toward the acid-free storage box that contained the jacket. "I have to admit, Captain, I'm confused about why a vintage flight jacket would require the attention of naval intelligence." Captain Morrison's expression remained carefully neutral as she pulled on cotton gloves and lifted the jacket from its protective wrapping. Her initial examination appeared routine, but Sarah noticed the subtle changes in the officer's demeanor as she studied specific details, a slight tightening around the eyes when she examined the zipper, a nearly imperceptible pause as she traced the unusual pocket configurations with her finger. "Tell me exactly how you acquired this," Captain Morrison said, her voice maintaining the same professional tone while her hands continued their methodical examination. Sarah recounted the previous Saturday's events, from her initial attraction to the garage sale to her conversation with Eleanor Hawkins. Captain Morrison listened without interruption, occasionally making notes in a small leather portfolio that she kept positioned so Sarah couldn't see the writing. "Mrs. Hawkins mentioned her husband found this in his father's possessions," Sarah concluded. She seemed to think it was just old military surplus. "Harold Hawkins," Captain Morrison repeated, consulting her notes. "Navy career from 1965 to 2007. Served primarily in communications and electronic warfare. His father was Master Chief Petty Officer James Hawkins. Served 1943 to 1968. She looked up at Sarah. "Did Mrs. Hawkins mention anything specific about her father-in-law's service record?" Sarah shook her head, only that he had been in the Navy for a long time. She was more focused on clearing out the house before the move. Captain Morrison turned the jacket inside out, paying particular attention to the inner collar and the various compartments Sarah had noticed. When she reached the leather tag bearing the serial number, she paused for a longer moment than any other part of her examination. "Dr. Mitchell, I'm going to ask you some questions, and I need completely honest answers," Captain Morrison said, setting the jacket aside and fixing Sarah with a direct stare. "Have you shared information about this jacket with anyone other than Dr. Chun?" "No, ma'am." "Have you photographed it or documented it in any way?" Sarah hesitated. "I took some reference photos for my research, but they're just stored on my personal laptop. I'll need you to provide those files to me before I leave today," Captain Morrison said. "Have you attempted to research the serial number or manufacturer codes online?" "Yes, but everything came back classified." That's what prompted Dr. Chun to contact you. Captain Morrison exchanged a look with Dr. Chun that Sarah couldn't interpret. Dr. Mitchell, what I'm about to tell you is going to sound unusual, but I need you to understand the seriousness of the situation you've stumbled into. Sarah felt her pulse quicken. What kind of situation? This jacket, Captain Morrison said, gesturing toward the artifact, is part of equipment that was issued for a highly classified operation in 1962. An operation that, officially, never happened. The words hung in the air like smoke from an extinguished candle. Sarah looked from Captain Morrison to Dr. Chun, searching for some indication that this was an elaborate joke or misunderstanding. I don't understand, Sarah said finally. If the operation never happened, how can the jacket exist? Captain Morrison leaned back in her chair, seeming to weigh her words carefully. Sometimes, Dr. Mitchell, the most important military operations are the ones that history never records. Sometimes the success of a mission depends on ensuring that no evidence of its existence ever surfaces. Are you saying this jacket is evidence of something that's still classified after 60 years? I'm saying this jacket should not exist anywhere outside of a very secure facility, and the fact that it ended up in a garage sale represents a significant security concern. Sarah's mind raced through the implications. But Harold Hawkins was just a communications specialist. How would he have access to equipment from a classified operation? That's exactly what we need to determine, Captain Morrison replied. Master Chief Petty Officer James Hawkins's service record shows assignments to several installations that were involved in experimental programs during the early 1960s. It's possible he was selected for temporary duty that doesn't appear in his official record. Dr. Chun, who had been quietly listening to the exchange, leaned forward. Captain, what exactly are you asking us to do here? For now, nothing beyond your normal security protocols, Captain Morrison said. The jacket will need to remain in your secure storage until I can arrange for proper disposal through official channels. Dr. Mitchell, I'll need you to sign some paperwork acknowledging that you've been briefed on the sensitive nature of this material. Sarah felt a surge of frustration. Captain, with respect, I'm a historian. My job is to preserve and study military artifacts, not to help bury them. If this jacket represents some unknown aspect of naval history, shouldn't it be studied? Captain Morrison's expression softened slightly, and, for the first time since arriving, she seemed to regard Sarah as more than just a potential security risk. Dr. Mitchell, I appreciate your dedication to historical preservation, but some history is preserved precisely by keeping it classified. Some operations were so sensitive that even their success depended on maintaining absolute secrecy. What kind of operation? Sarah pressed. Captain Morrison stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the harbor where modern naval vessels moved among the tourist attractions and commercial shipping. Are you familiar with the U-2 incident, Dr. Mitchell? Gary Powers, 1960, shot down over Soviet airspace during a reconnaissance flight. That incident nearly triggered a war because it proved American surveillance capabilities that the Soviets had only suspected. Now imagine if we had developed operational capabilities that made the U-2 look like a paper airplane. Imagine technology that, if revealed, could have fundamentally altered the balance of power during the most dangerous years of the Cold War. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the museum's air conditioning. You're talking about something that happened in 1962. The Cuban Missile Crisis, Dr. Mitchell. 13 days in October, when the world came closer to nuclear war than most people realize. Decisions were made during that period based on intelligence that officially doesn't exist, gathered by personnel who were never there, using equipment that was never manufactured. Captain Morrison returned to her seat and picked up the jacket again, her fingers tracing the impact marks Sarah had noticed. This jacket shows evidence of exposure to conditions that shouldn't have been possible with 1962 technology. Temperature extremes, atmospheric pressure changes, and electromagnetic effects that suggest the wearer operated in environments that were officially impossible to reach. Aerospace operations, Sarah said quietly. The piece is beginning to form a disturbing picture. I can't confirm or deny specific details, Dr. Mitchell, but I can tell you that Master Chief Hawkins was selected for his expertise in advanced communication systems and his psychological profile indicating exceptional reliability under stress. Dr. Chun had been making notes throughout the conversation, and he looked up with the expression of someone who had just solved a complex puzzle. Captain, are we talking about Operation Blue Gemini? Captain Morrison's face went completely still, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Dr. Chun, where did you hear that designation? I've encountered references to it in some declassified documents from the Kennedy administration, Dr. Chun said carefully. Always just fragmentary mentions, usually in context that suggested advanced reconnaissance capabilities that weren't acknowledged in official records. Those references should have been redacted, Captain Morrison said, her voice carrying a sharp edge that hadn't been present before. Sarah looked between them, sensing that she had somehow stumbled into the middle of something far more complex than a simple historical artifact. What was Operation Blue Gemini? Captain Morrison was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing her response. When she spoke, her voice carried the careful precision of someone who had been trained to reveal only what was absolutely necessary. Dr. Mitchell, what would you say if I told you that in 1962, the United States developed the capability to gather intelligence from altitudes and locations that wouldn't become officially possible until the Space Shuttle program in the 1980s? I'd say that sounds impossible with the technology available in 1962. Unless the technology wasn't officially available, Captain Morrison replied. Unless we had developed experimental aircraft that pushed the boundaries of what was thought possible, operated by personnel who were sworn to secrecy that lasted the rest of their lives. Sarah stared at the jacket lying on the conference table, its weathered leather surface suddenly, taking on an almost mystical significance. You're saying Master Chief Hawkins was involved in some kind of experimental aerospace program. I'm saying Master Chief Hawkins may have been one of a very small number of personnel selected for operations that officially never happened, using technology that officially didn't exist during a period when the future of human civilization hung in the balance. The implications were staggering. Sarah had spent years studying military history, but she had never encountered anything that suggested such advanced capabilities had existed so early in the space age. If Captain Morrison was telling the truth, then the jacket represented evidence of a technological leap that had been successfully concealed for over 60 years. Why are you telling us this? Dr. Chin asked. If this operation is still classified, why not just confiscate the jacket and deny it ever existed? Captain Morrison smiled for the first time since arriving, but it was a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Because, Dr. Chun, 60 years of secrecy may be coming to an end whether we want it to or not. And when that happens, we're going to need historians who understand the true context of what they're dealing with. 3 days after Captain Morrison's visit, Sarah found herself standing on Eleanor Hawkins's doorstep, clutching a folder of carefully selected photographs and fighting the nervous energy that had plagued her since the intelligence officer's departure. Captain Morrison had given her explicit instructions to gather any additional information about the jacket's provenance, but to do so without revealing the classified nature of their discussion. Eleanor answered the door wearing a faded floral housecoat, her silver hair pinned back with bobby pins that had seen better decades. Her eyes brightened when she recognized Sarah, though the brightness was tempered by the weariness of recent grief. "Oh my, Dr. Mitchell, how lovely to see you again. Please come in," Eleanor said, stepping aside to welcome Sarah into a living room that spoke of a lifetime spent in military housing around the world. The walls displayed a careful arrangement of certificates, photographs, and mementos that told the story of a Navy family's journey through 42 years of service. "Mrs. Hawkins, I hope you don't mind my stopping by unannounced," Sarah began, settling into an oversized chair that still held the impression of its regular occupant. "I've been researching the jacket I purchased at your sale, and I was hoping you might be able to tell me more about your father-in-law's service record." Eleanor's expression shifted slightly, a shadow of something Sarah couldn't quite identify crossing her features. James Hawkins was a complicated man she said slowly. Harold always said his father carried secrets that he never shared with anyone, even family. Sarah opened her folder and withdrew a photograph she had taken of the jacket's interior label. This jacket appears to be much older than typical military surplus, and it has some unusual characteristics. I'm trying to establish its historical significance for the museum's collection. Eleanor accepted the photograph with hands that trembled slightly, whether from age or emotion Sarah couldn't determine. She studied the image for a long moment, her lips moving silently as if reading something Sarah couldn't see. I haven't seen this in probably 20 years, Eleanor said finally. Harold found it when we were cleaning out James's apartment after he passed in 1995. The old man was 91 and sharp as a tack right up until the end, but he never would talk about some parts of his service. Do you remember anything specific he might have said about this jacket? Eleanor set the photograph aside and walked to a glass-fronted cabinet filled with military memorabilia. She withdrew a small wooden box and returned to her seat, holding it with the reverence reserved for sacred objects. James gave this to Harold just before he died, Eleanor explained, opening the box to reveal a collection of medals, ribbons, and what appeared to be several small electronic components. He said there were things about his service that Harold needed to know, but only after he was gone. Sarah leaned forward, her historian's instincts immediately recognizing that she was being offered access to primary source material of potentially extraordinary significance. What did he tell Harold? That's just it, Eleanor said with a frustrated sigh. Harold tried to research it for years, but he kept running into walls. Official records that didn't match what his father had told him, assignments that seemed to have gaps, and technology that Harold swore was decades ahead of what should have existed in the 1960s. Eleanor lifted one of the electronic components, a small device about the size of a deck of cards with connections Sarah didn't recognize. James told Harold this was part of his communication equipment from what he called the high-altitude missions. But when Harold showed it to some of his electronics friends, they said the miniaturization and design were impossible with 1960s technology. Sarah's pulse quickened as she recognized potential corroboration for Captain Morrison's hints about advanced technology. Did he ever mention specific operations or assignments? Only once, and Harold made me promise never to repeat it, Eleanor said, glancing around as if someone might be listening. About 5 years ago, Harold was watching some documentary about the Cuban Missile Crisis, and he got this strange look on his face. He said his father had told him that the official story wasn't complete, that there had been intelligence gathering operations that provided crucial information to President Kennedy. Eleanor paused, seeming to wrestle with her conscience about violating her late husband's confidence. Harold said James claimed he had been part of missions that observed Soviet installations from positions that officially didn't exist. He said they could see everything the Russians were doing in Cuba, but from altitudes that weren't supposed to be possible. Sarah felt a chill of recognition. Captain Morrison's references to impossible reconnaissance capabilities suddenly seemed much more concrete. Mrs. Hawkins, did your father-in-law ever mention anything about experimental aircraft or special training? Harold said James had scars on his hands and arms that looked like burn marks, but not from fire. More like exposure to extreme cold or some kind of chemical reaction. When Harold asked about them, James would just say they were from working with new equipment that didn't always cooperate. Eleanor returned to the wooden box and withdrew a small leather journal, its pages yellowed with age. I found this in Harold's desk after he passed. He had been trying to piece together his father's story based on the few things James had shared over the years. Sarah accepted the journal with hands that trembled slightly. The pages were filled with Harold's neat handwriting, dates, locations, and notes that seemed to chronicle a son's attempt to understand his father's mysterious service record. Many entries were followed by question marks or notes like, official record or classified, access denied. One entry in particular caught Sarah's attention. October 1962. Father claims assignment to Observation Team Delta, Mission duration 13 days, location classified as high-altitude reconnaissance. Equipment included experimental communications gear and specialized protective equipment. Father mentioned seeing everything from above the weather and providing real-time intelligence that prevented a war. Mrs. Hawkins, Sarah said carefully, did Harold ever try to get official confirmation of these missions? Eleanor's expression grew troubled. He tried for decades, but every inquiry resulted in the same response. No records found or access denied. Harold started to think maybe his father had been having memory problems in his later years, making up stories about secret missions. But the physical evidence suggests otherwise. That's what kept Harold puzzled. Eleanor agreed. The equipment, the jacket, the scars, all of it pointed to something much more complex than the official record indicated. Harold was convinced his father had been involved in operations that were so classified they didn't appear in any normal military documentation. Sarah turned to another page in the journal and found what appeared to be a hand-drawn diagram of the jacket with detailed notes about its construction and unusual features. Harold had been remarkably observant, noting the same details about pocket configurations and hardware that had caught Sarah's attention. Harold wrote here about modification ports in the jacket's collar and sleeves, Sarah said, pointing to specific notations. Did he have any idea what those were for? He thought they might have been for connecting electronic equipment, Eleanor replied. James had mentioned wearing communication gear that was built into his flight suit rather than carried separately. Harold said it sounded like something from science fiction, but the modifications to the jacket seemed to support his father's claims. Eleanor stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the quiet suburban street where children played and neighbors tended their gardens. You know, Dr. Mitchell, Harold spent the last years of his life trying to understand whether his father had been a hero or was suffering from some kind of fantasy related to his military service. It would mean everything to me to know which one was true. Sarah closed the journal and considered her response carefully. Captain Morrison's warnings about the sensitive nature of the information weighed against Eleanor's obvious need for closure about her family's history. Mrs. Hawkins, based on my research so far, I can tell you that your father-in-law's claims are consistent with some very specialized operations that took place during the 1960s, Sarah said diplomatically. The physical evidence strongly suggests he was involved in advanced programs that wouldn't appear in standard military records. Eleanor turned back from the window, hope and skepticism warring in her expression. You really think James was telling the truth about secret missions? I think Master Chief Hawkins was involved in operations that were so important they remain classified even today, Sarah said, choosing her words with care. The jacket and equipment you've shown me represent the kind of specialized gear that would only be issued to personnel involved in extremely sensitive assignments. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears, whether from relief or renewed grief, Sarah couldn't tell. Harold would have been so happy to hear that. He never stopped believing in his father, even when the evidence seemed impossible. Sarah spent another hour reviewing Harold's notes and examining the additional artifacts Eleanor shared. Each piece of evidence painted a picture of a man who had been selected for operations that pushed the boundaries of 1960s technology and human capability. As Sarah prepared to leave, Eleanor pressed the leather journal into her hands. Please, Dr. Mitchell, take this with you. Harold would want it to be part of any official research into his father's service. Maybe someday the full story can be told. Driving back to the museum, Sarah reflected on the weight of responsibility she now carried. The journal contained detailed observations that could potentially fill gaps in the official historical record, but only if she could navigate the complex security considerations that surrounded the entire situation. Captain Morrison had been clear about the continuing sensitivity of Operation Blue Gemini, but Eleanor's revelation suggested that the human cost of that secrecy extended far beyond the original participants. Harold Hawkins had spent decades wondering whether his father had been a hero or had been suffering from delusions, never knowing that the truth lay somewhere in between, in the shadowy world of operations that were too important to acknowledge and too dangerous to forget. That evening, Sarah called Dr. Chun to brief him on her discoveries. His response was immediate and concerned. "Sarah, you need to contact Captain Morrison right away," he said. "If Harold Hawkins was conducting private research into classified operations, there may be other materials out there that could cause problems for people who are still bound by security oaths." Sarah realized with growing unease that her simple garage sale discovery had opened a door to a much larger and more complex situation than anyone had initially realized. The jacket was no longer just a historical artifact. It was a key to understanding operations that had shaped the Cold War in ways that were still too sensitive to acknowledge publicly. As she prepared a report for Captain Morrison, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was about to become part of a story that was still being written 60 years after it had officially never begun. Captain Morrison's return to the Maritime Museum came without the formal courtesy of her previous visit. Sarah arrived at work Monday morning to find the intelligence officer already waiting in Dr. Chen's office, her expression carrying an intensity that immediately set Sarah on edge. "Dr. Mitchell," Captain Morrison said without preamble, "we need to discuss your visit with Mrs. Hawkins." Immediately, Sarah settled into the chair across from Captain Morrison's temporary position behind Dr. Chen's desk, noting that her supervisor was conspicuously absent for what was clearly going to be a sensitive conversation. "I followed your instructions to gather additional information about the jacket's provenance," Sarah began, but Captain Morrison held up a hand to stop her. "Dr. Mitchell, I'm going to be very direct with you because the situation has become significantly more complicated than any of us anticipated," Captain Morrison said, opening a thick folder that definitely hadn't been present during their first meeting. "Eleanor Hawkins contacted the Pentagon yesterday afternoon." Sarah felt her stomach drop. "I didn't tell her anything about our conversation or the classified nature of the jacket." "I know, but Mrs. Hawkins has been in contact with several veterans organizations over the past year, trying to get recognition for her late husband's service record. When you showed renewed interest in her father-in-law's military career, she interpreted it as validation for claims she's been making about missing documentation." Captain Morrison slid an official-looking document across the desk. "This is a formal inquiry submitted by Mrs. Hawkins requesting a review of Master Chief James Hawkins' service record for possible posthumous decoration. She specifically mentioned your visit and claimed that a military historian had found evidence supporting her family's claims about classified missions." Sarah scanned the document, recognizing Eleanor's desperate hope to validate her family's history reflected in every carefully worded paragraph. "Captain, I was very careful not to confirm any classified information. I believe you, Dr. Mitchell, but the damage is already done. Mrs. Hawkins's inquiry has triggered a formal review process that will involve multiple agencies and potentially expose information that has remained successfully classified for over 60 years. Captain Morrison stood and walked to the window, her posture reflecting the weight of decisions that extended far beyond a simple historical curiosity. "Dr. Mitchell, I'm about to share information with you that will require you to sign documentation acknowledging your awareness of extremely sensitive material. Are you prepared for that level of responsibility?" Sarah nodded, though she felt increasingly certain that her simple garage sale purchase had set in motion events that would fundamentally change her understanding of both military history and her own role as a historian. Operation Blue Gemini was established in August 1962 as a direct response to increasing Soviet activity in Cuba. Captain Morrison began, returning to her seat with the deliberate movements of someone who had made the decision to cross a line that couldn't be uncrossed. The operation involved 12 specially selected personnel who underwent training in experimental aerospace technology that wouldn't become publicly acknowledged for another 20 years. Sarah listened with growing amazement as Captain Morrison outlined an operation that sounded like science fiction, but was being described with the precise terminology of official military briefing. The technology involved was based on research that had been conducted since the late 1950s into high-altitude reconnaissance platforms that could operate above the range of Soviet detection capabilities. Captain Morrison continued. Master Chief Hawkins was selected specifically for his expertise in advanced communications and his psychological profile indicating exceptional stability under extreme conditions. What kind of extreme conditions? Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Near space operations, Dr. Mitchell. Altitudes exceeding 80,000 feet, using experimental aircraft that combined rocket propulsion with advanced aerodynamic design. The personnel involved wore specially designed pressure suits and carried communication equipment that allowed real-time intelligence transmission from positions that the Soviets couldn't possibly intercept or attack. Captain Morrison opened another section of her folder and withdrew what appeared to be mission photographs, grainy black, and white images that showed aerial views of what Sarah recognized as Cuban terrain. These photographs were taken during Operation Blue Gemini missions in October 1962. They provided President Kennedy with real-time intelligence about Soviet missile installations that proved crucial to resolving the Cuban Missile Crisis without military confrontation. Sarah studied the photographs with the trained eye of a historian, noting the clarity and detail that seemed far superior to anything she had seen from acknowledged reconnaissance flights of that era. The image quality is remarkable for 1962 technology. Because it wasn't 1962 technology, at least not officially, Captain Morrison replied. The aircraft and equipment used in Operation Blue Gemini represented technological advances that wouldn't become public knowledge until the development of the State Route 71 Blackbird and later space-based reconnaissance systems. Where did this technology come from? Captain Morrison's expression grew carefully neutral. That information remains classified even today, Dr. Mitchell. What I can tell you is that the 12 personnel selected for Operation Blue Gemini represented the most advanced human flight capability the United States possessed during the Cold War period. Sarah thought about the scars Eleanor had described on James Hawkins's arms and hands. The physical evidence Mrs. Hawkins showed me suggests Master Chief Hawkins experienced significant trauma during these operations. Near-space flight in 1962 involved risks that we barely understood, Captain Morrison acknowledged. The equipment was experimental, the environment was hostile, and the personnel involved were essentially test pilots for technology that pushed the absolute limits of human endurance. Why maintain the secrecy after 60 years? The Cold War is over, the Soviet Union no longer exists, and most of the personnel involved are presumably deceased. Captain Morrison was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing her response. Dr. Mitchell, some secrets are maintained not because of what they reveal about the past, but because of what they might suggest about current capabilities. Operation Blue Gemini demonstrated technological achievements that, if acknowledged today, might provide insights into classified programs that remain operational. The implications were staggering. Sarah was beginning to understand that the jacket represented not just historical evidence of a secret operation, but potentially a window into ongoing classified capabilities that extended far beyond what the general public imagined possible. Captain, what exactly are you asking me to do? Sarah asked, sensing that their conversation was approaching some kind of decision point. I'm asking you to help us manage a situation that has gotten beyond our normal containment protocols, Captain Morrison replied. Mrs. Hawkins's formal inquiry has triggered a review process that will eventually result in some level of official acknowledgement of Master Chief Hawkins's classified service. The question is how much information becomes public and how it's presented. Sarah felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders like a lead blanket. You want me to help control the narrative. I want you to help ensure that any information that becomes public is presented in appropriate historical context by someone who understands both the significance of the operations and the continuing sensitivity of the technology involved. Captain Morrison reached into her folder and withdrew a final document. Dr. Mitchell, I'm prepared to offer you temporary security clearance and access to classified materials related to Operation Blue Gemini, with the understanding that you would serve as a historical consultant during the review process. Sarah stared at the document, recognizing that signing it would fundamentally change her career and possibly her life. The simple garage sale discovery had evolved into an opportunity to access some of the most closely guarded secrets in military history, but with responsibilities that extended far beyond academic research. What about Eleanor Hawkins? She deserves to know the truth about her family's service. Mrs. Hawkins will receive appropriate recognition for her family's sacrifices, Captain Morrison assured her. Master Chief Hawkins will receive posthumous decoration for his service in classified operations, and his family will be provided with as much information as security considerations allow. Sarah thought about Harold Hawkins spending decades wondering whether his father had been a hero or had been suffering from delusions about secret missions. The opportunity to provide closure for Eleanor while contributing to the historical record was compelling, but the security implications were daunting. If I agree to this, what exactly will my role involve? You would review classified materials related to Operation Blue Gemini and prepare historical analysis that could be used to brief officials involved in the review process, Captain Morrison explained. You would also help develop public information materials that acknowledge the operation's existence while protecting details that remain sensitive. Captain Morrison leaned forward, her expression reflecting both professional necessity and personal appeal. Dr. Mitchell, in my 15 years with naval intelligence, I've never encountered a situation quite like this. We have a classified operation that succeeded brilliantly, but was never supposed to be acknowledged. Personnel families who deserve recognition for extraordinary service, and technology implications that could affect current national security interests. And you think I can help navigate all of those competing concerns? I think you're uniquely positioned to understand both the historical significance and the human impact of what we're dealing with, Captain Morrison replied. You've already demonstrated appropriate discretion and genuine concern for the families involved. The question is whether you're prepared to take on responsibilities that extend beyond normal historical research. Sarah looked out the window at the harbor, where modern naval vessels moved among the historical ships that represented decades of preserved military heritage. Her career had been built on the principle that history should be preserved and shared for the benefit of future generations. But Operation Blue Gemini represented history that had been deliberately hidden for reasons that remain valid today. Captain, if I sign this document, am I helping to preserve history or helping to bury it deeper? Captain Morrison smiled with what appeared to be genuine warmth for the first time since Sarah had met her. Dr. Mitchell, you're helping to ensure that when this story is finally told, and it will be told, it's told by someone who understands that the most important history is often the most complicated history. Sarah reached for the pen Captain Morrison had placed beside the security clearance documents. When do I start? Tomorrow morning. There's a facility at Coronado where you'll be briefed on materials that will give you the full context of Operation Blue Gemini and Master Chief Hawkins' role in preventing what could have been the Third World War. As Sarah signed the documents that would grant her access to some of the most closely guarded secrets in American military history, she couldn't help but wonder what other garage sales might contain artifacts that could rewrite the history books. The weathered leather jacket had proven to be a key to understanding operations that had shaped the world in ways that remained too sensitive to acknowledge publicly, even 60 years later. 6 months later, Sarah stood in a secure conference room at Naval Air Station Coronado, watching as Eleanor Hawkins carefully opened a presentation folder bearing the official seal of the Department of the Navy. The elderly woman's hands trembled slightly as she lifted out a citation for the Navy Distinguished Service Medal, posthumously awarded to Master Chief Petty Officer James Hawkins for extraordinary service in classified operations of vital importance to national security during the period October 1962. Mrs. Hawkins, Rear Admiral Patricia Kellerman said gently, "Your father-in-law's service during Operation Blue Gemini provided intelligence that was crucial to President Kennedy's decision-making during the Cuban Missile Crisis. His willingness to participate in experimental operations that pushed the boundaries of human flight capability helped prevent what could have been a nuclear war. Eleanor read the citation with tears streaming down her cheeks, her fingers tracing each word as if to ensure it was real. "Harold would have been so proud," she whispered. "He never stopped believing his father was a hero." Sarah watched the ceremony from the side of the room, reflecting on the months of careful research and delicate negotiations that had made this moment possible. Her access to classified materials had revealed a story that was both more remarkable and more complex than anyone had initially imagined. Operation Blue Gemini had involved 12 specially trained personnel who operated experimental aircraft capable of sustained flight at altitudes exceeding 85,000 feet. The technology combined rocket propulsion with advanced aerodynamic design, creating reconnaissance platforms that could observe Soviet installations in Cuba from positions that were essentially unreachable by 1962 defensive systems. Master Chief Hawkins had been selected not only for his technical expertise, but for his exceptional psychological stability under extreme conditions. The missions required personnel to operate in near-space environments wearing primitive pressure suits while managing complex communication equipment that transmitted real-time intelligence directly to the Pentagon. The physical evidence Sarah had observed, the unusual jacket construction, the mysterious electronic components, and the scarring Eleanor had described, all made perfect sense once she understood the extreme conditions these men had operated under. The jacket had been specifically designed to interface with life support and communication systems that wouldn't become standard until the Space Shuttle program 20 years later. But perhaps most remarkably, Sarah had learned that Operation Blue Gemini had been successful beyond anyone's expectations. The intelligence provided by Hawkins and his colleagues had given President Kennedy detailed, real-time information about Soviet missile deployments that proved crucial during the 13 days that brought the world closer to nuclear war than most people ever realized. "Dr. Mitchell," Admiral Kellerman said, approaching Sarah as Eleanor continued to study her father-in-law citation, "I understand we have you to thank for bringing this situation to our attention in a way that allowed us to provide appropriate recognition while maintaining necessary security protocols." Sarah nodded, still somewhat amazed by the journey that had brought her from a weekend garage sale to a classified military facility. "Admiral, it's been an honor to help ensure that Master Chief Hawkins and the other Operation Blue Gemini personnel receive the recognition they deserve. The declassified report you prepared will become part of the official historical record," Admiral Kellerman continued. "Future military historians will have access to information about these operations that acknowledges their significance while protecting details that remain sensitive." Sarah had spent months crafting a historical analysis that walked the delicate line between transparency and security. Her report acknowledged the existence of Operation Blue Gemini and its crucial role during the Cuban Missile Crisis while protecting specific technical details and operational procedures that could affect current military capabilities. The process had required her to develop an entirely new approach to historical documentation, one that recognized the legitimate need for operational secrecy while ensuring that the sacrifices and achievements of military personnel weren't lost to history. Eleanor approached them, still clutching her father-in-law's citation. "Dr. Mitchell, I can never thank you enough for what you've done for our family. James can finally receive the recognition he earned, and Harold's memory is vindicated. Mrs. Hawkins, your family's willingness to share those artifacts with me made all of this possible," Sarah replied. "Master Chief Hawkins' service deserves to be remembered, and I'm grateful I could play a small role in making that happen." As they prepared to leave the secure facility, Sarah reflected on the broader implications of her experience. Operation Blue Gemini represented just one example of classified military operations that had shaped world history in ways the public never knew. How many other garage sales might contain artifacts that could illuminate hidden chapters of the Cold War? How many families carried stories of service that couldn't be officially acknowledged? But perhaps most importantly, Sarah had learned that the tension between transparency and security wasn't always adversarial. With careful consideration and appropriate safeguards, it was possible to honor military service and preserve historical truth while protecting legitimate national security interests. 3 weeks later, Sarah received a call from a veteran in Portland whose father had left behind some unusual equipment from his service in Korea. The man described items that sounded remarkably similar to the advanced communication gear Eleanor had shown her, suggesting that experimental operations like Blue Gemini might have been more extensive than even the classified records indicated. As Sarah prepared for another research trip, she couldn't help but smile at the irony. Her career had been transformed by what she initially thought was a simple vintage jacket, but which had proven to be a key to understanding some of the most important and closely guarded operations in American military history. The weathered leather jacket now resided in a climate-controlled storage facility at the Naval History and Heritage Command, where it would be preserved as evidence of the extraordinary lengths to which military personnel had gone to protect their country during one of the most dangerous periods in human history. But, more importantly, Master Chief James Hawkins's name would be included in official records as one of 12 men whose willingness to risk their lives in experimental aircraft helped prevent a nuclear war that could have ended human civilization. Eleanor Hawkins had received the closure she sought about her family's military service, and Harold's years of patient research had been vindicated. The old man who had carried secrets for 60 years could finally be recognized as the hero his son had always believed him to be. For Sarah, the experience had redefined her understanding of military history and her role as a historian. She had learned that some of the most important stories were the ones that couldn't be told for decades after they happened, and that preserving history sometimes required accepting that complete transparency might have to wait for future generations. As she prepared her report for the museum board about the Blue Gemini research project, Sarah included a recommendation that would change how the institution approached potential acquisitions. Going forward, any military artifacts with unusual characteristics or unclear provenance would be subject to preliminary security review before being cataloged or displayed. The recommendation was unanimously approved, along with a new position, Director of Classified Historical Research, with Sarah as the first appointee. Her role would involve working with military intelligence agencies to identify and preserve historical artifacts while respecting ongoing security requirements. Dr. Chun, who had been quietly supportive throughout the entire process, congratulated Sarah on her promotion with characteristic understatement. "You know, Sarah, when I suggested you contact Captain Morrison about that jacket, I never imagined it would lead to a complete restructuring of our research protocols." Sarah laughed, remembering her initial assumption that she had simply found an interesting piece of vintage military equipment. "Dr. Chun, I think this experience has taught me that we should never underestimate the potential significance of what appears to be ordinary military surplus, or the importance of garage sales to military history research." 6 months later, Sarah received another call from Captain Morrison, now Admiral Morrison, following her promotion to head Naval Intelligence Historical Review Operations. 3 more families had come forward with artifacts and stories related to classified operations from the 1960s, and the Pentagon had decided to establish a formal program for reviewing and potentially acknowledging previously classified military achievements. "Dr. Mitchell," Admiral Morrison said during their phone conversation, "your work on the Blue Gemini documentation has become a model for how we handle similar situations. Would you be interested in leading a team of historians who specialize in classified military operations research?" Sarah accepted the position, knowing that her career had been fundamentally changed by a $5 garage sale purchase that had seemed insignificant at the time. The weathered leather jacket had opened a door to understanding military history that most people never knew existed, and had provided closure for families who had carried the burden of unacknowledged service for decades. As she cleaned out her desk at the Maritime Museum in preparation for her new position, Sarah found the original photographs she had taken of the jacket before understanding its significance. The images looked exactly the same, but her understanding of what they represented had been completely transformed. That evening, Sarah called Eleanor Hawkins to share the news about her new position, and to check on how the elderly woman was adjusting to finally having official recognition of her family's military service. "Oh, Dr. Mitchell, I'm so proud of what you've accomplished," Eleanor said, her voice carrying the warmth that had characterized their relationship from their first meeting at the garage sale. James and Harold would both be amazed to know that their old jacket led to such important work. "Mrs. Hawkins, I hope you know that your willingness to share your family's story made all of this possible. Master Chief Hawkins' service will be remembered because you preserved those artifacts and kept Harold's research. You know," Eleanor said thoughtfully, "I've been thinking about cleaning out the attic again. I found some more of James's things up there, including what looks like some kind of logbook or diary. Would you be interested in taking a look?" Sarah smiled, recognizing the familiar excitement of potential historical discovery. "Mrs. Hawkins, I'll be there Saturday morning." As she hung up the phone, Sarah reflected on the lesson that had emerged from her experience with Operation Blue Gemini. Some of the most important history is hidden in the most ordinary places, waiting for someone with the curiosity to ask questions and the persistence to seek answers, even when those answers lead to extraordinary responsibilities. The garage sale jacket had taught her that military history wasn't just about battles and campaigns that appeared in textbooks, but about the quiet heroes who risked their lives in operations that officially never happened, and about the families who preserved their stories long enough for history to finally acknowledge their sacrifice. Tomorrow would bring new discoveries, new families seeking recognition for unacknowledged service, and new opportunities to ensure that important history wasn't lost to the requirements of national security. Sarah had found her calling in the intersection between transparency and secrecy, where the most important stories often waited decades to be told.